I spent the first 2 decades of my life in a quiet New England town. At the far end of the town green, partially surrounded by a thick hedge, is a small bronze plaque marking the location of a time capsule buried in 1953 on the bicentennial of the town's founding. The capsule is still there, but my story concerns a 2-week period when it was located in the trunk of my Cutlass Supreme. On Thanksgiving night, on the year I graduated college, a friend and I decided that when the town alderman dedicated the capsule to posterity, they actually meant us. So while the satiated town drifted off to sleep, we unearthed the 3-foot square riveted steel box and loaded it into my car. The capsule proved to be a tough nut to crack. We tried every tool in my father's garage before we resigned ourselves to the fact that only a blowtorch could reveal the contents of the capsule. Young as we were and unused to defeat, we fell to bickering and mutual recriminations. In the end, I was stuck with the white elephant, and for a lack of a better place, I decided to keep it in the trunk of my car. The next day, the strange phone calls began. Oddly enough, they always came when I was alone in the house. When I picked up the receiver, a tinny, androgynous voice on the other end of the line would repeat, "Put the capsule back." Or, "It's very important that you put the capsule back," until I hung up. The voice talked straight through any questions I put to it, almost as though the speaker couldn't hear me. My first thought was that the calls came from my co-conspirator, something that he steadfastly denied. Now, I knew better than to take him for his word, but other circumstances made me think he was telling the truth. The phone calls were always preceded by small but noticeable electrical anomalies in the house, like flickering lights or poor TV and radio reception, and sometimes the smell of ozone. Also, and this is difficult to put into words, the calls left me with blurry vision and muffled hearing and a profound fatigue. The last call, the one that drove me to leave the capsule on the steps of the town hall, came on a Sunday morning when my parents were away at church. For several minutes prior to the first ring, I noticed that the house seemed to become charged with electricity. My every motion seemed to yield shocks that increased in severity. When the phone rang, the TV screen flickered and dissolved into the staticky pattern that people usually call snow, and the voice was louder than usual. The whole house was humming, as if the speaker was expending massive amounts of energy to contact me. The instant before I hung up, the TV screen was beginning to resolve into a silhouette of a face. The call stopped abruptly after I returned the capsule. I can only imagine that someone in the future had a very important reason for wanting the capsule to remain buried. This event happened in Leeds, England. It was around 1 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon in July 2010. I had been given the day off work to prepare myself for taking over the full role of my promotion that I had been given in the week previous. I was at home lying on the couch playing Doodle Jump on my iPhone, and my dad was on his chair reading the paper, us both just generally dossing about. The phone began to ring. My father was reading his paper and showed no intention to answer, so I propped up and walked over to answer it. There was a deathly silence at first, then a small click, which immediately made me think, bloody cold callers, what are they trying to sell me now? "Hello," I said. It took another second or so, but the reply came.
"Hello, my darling."
The voice was familiar, yet unusual.
"I heard about your promotion, well done."
The voice initially reminded me of my mother, who we no longer lived with, but it seemed unusual, as I had told her about my promotion on the week previous. Then I noticed the slight Irish twang to the voice. "Grandma?" I said, not quite believing what I was saying or hearing, as my grandma had been dead for 3 years by this point. This seemed to pique my dad's interest. He raised his gaze from the newspaper to me.
Yes, my little poppet.
I was at a loss for words. It was definitely my grandmother's voice, and was even using her pet name for me.
I've missed you, you know, poppet.
I've missed you too, Grandma. How are you?
Ah, not too bad, you know me. Always keeping myself busy. I'd go mad if I didn't.
I was a little bit stunned. I looked over at my father, who had a concerned look on his face. So I lowered the phone slightly and told him that it was Grandma calling to see how we were doing. She's dead, he said. My grandmother chuckled and said,
Tell your dad we still like to keep in contact.
Unreal. The conversation with Grandma carried on another 30 seconds or so, as she asked how other members of the family are doing. Then she exclaimed,
Oh, I almost forgot. Do you know, I'd forget my head if it wasn't screwed on. I wanted to tell you about a film I just saw. It's called See You Daddy, Miss You Gladly. It's brilliant. Oh, you'll have to give it a watch.
This is weird, I thought, but I assured her I'd look into it. Then the conversation started to turn a little bizarre. She said she missed the sound of my voice and wanted to hear my voice some more before she had to go, and declared the best way would be for me to name all the movies that I could think of, starting at A, all the way down to Z. This strikes me as too peculiar, as my grandmother wasn't that into movies anyway. Why though? I asked. I just don't see the point of this.
Come on, it's been a long time. I just want to hear you talk some more, my love.
I glanced over at my dad, who had completely put down the newspaper and was just staring intently at me. This broke my concentration a bit, and my suspicion rose. Right, who is this? I demanded. Now sure, it was a very distasteful prank call.
It's your grandma.
The voice bellowed back, less convincingly this time, and started to crack and become deep, to the point the voice sounded almost inhuman, slightly mechanical. Now I was convinced this wasn't my grandmother. I've had enough of you now. I'm bored. You're not my grandmother, and I've got a whole load of nothing I'd rather be doing than standing here talking to you, I said. The voice then began laughing, almost hysterically, then said,
Well, it's not over.
Good luck with that, I replied before hanging up. Do you believe that? I said to my dad. This is where the story takes another turn. My dad then told me his version of events. Apparently, the phone hadn't rung at all. My dad said he just saw me walk over to the phone and pick it up, and he assumed I was going to call somebody. Then naturally he started to become annoyed and worried when I claimed to be talking to my deceased grandmother, thinking I was going a bit far just to wind him up. I checked the phone record, and there was no recent calls, incoming or outgoing. I'm convinced it was something impersonating my grandmother. How it knew her voice, I don't know, but its intent was to try to master my voice and my mannerisms, so it could impersonate me for whatever reason. Sounds like a brief psychotic episode, right? The fact that his dad witnessed this whole thing but didn't hear the phone ring seems to confirm it. Well, I came across another story that is very similar, but this happened to a toddler. It seems strange to me that someone so young would have the same delusion. My son Jason died in July 1994 at a Pink Floyd concert at RFK Stadium. He adored his nephew, my grandson, who at the time was 21 months old. We were all sitting around my mother's house a few days after Jason died. He grew up in that house, and we weren't talking about him or anything, just sitting around. All of a sudden, my grandson got up, went into the dining room, picked up the phone, and started carrying on a conversation. I will. I am. Okay. Uh-huh. Mum asked who he was talking to. He looked at her like she should know and answered, Uncle Jason, very matter-of-factly, and handed her the phone. She held the receiver to her ear, and there was just dead air. No dial tone, and no operator telling her to hang up and call later, or anything. Two or 3 years ago, I was on the phone late at night with my boyfriend. He had been out of town, so we were catching up on things. It began as a late call, and finally we decided to go to bed at around 3 or 4 a.m. It was like, well, I can hardly stay awake. I think I'm going to go to bed. What do you think, Larry? He agreed. So we said our I love yous and said good night, when at the same time, a creepy voice of a man said, Okay, good night. There was a funny click sound, and then silence. We were both startled, to say the least. No one else was home at either of our places, so it wasn't a family member playing a joke or anything. It is so weird to think that whoever or whatever that was, they were listening in on the whole conversation for all of that time. My brother's friend, JB, had moved out of state for college. When he moved back, he went to get his out-of-state license converted at the DMV. The man gave him a hard time and said he couldn't abbreviate his name, to which he replied, But that is my name, JB, it's not abbreviated. The man insisted that he couldn't use an abbreviation and that he would have to redo the paperwork. And so, as he was filling out the line for his first name, he wrote, J only, B only. When he got his license back, his name was John Lee Bonley.